The unexpected journey begins. It was a busy Friday afternoon, and the terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with activity. Families, business travelers, and tourists all bustled about, dragging suitcases and jostling to find their gates. Among them was the Adams family: John, a calm and composed father; Marie, a nurturing and detail-oriented mother; and their two children, Lily, a curious 8-year-old, and Max, a playful 5-year-old. The family was en route to Miami for a much-anticipated vacation. They had planned this trip for months, saving up to treat their kids to a magical week of sun, beaches, and adventure. Boarding their flight, they were filled with excitement, a rare moment where everything seemed to align perfectly. As they reached their assigned seats, 2 rows at the back of the plane, John helped lift their luggage into the overhead compartment, while Marie guided Lily and Max into their seats. Passengers around them smiled warmly as Max asked innocently, "Are we flying in the clouds, Dad?" John chuckled. "That's right, buddy. You'll see the clouds up close." Everything appeared routine as the family settled in, adjusting seatbelts and pulling out activities to keep the kids entertained during the 3-hour flight. But that sense of calm would not last long. The encounter. A few minutes before the flight was scheduled to depart, a tall, confident flight attendant named Rebecca strolled down the aisle. Rebecca was known among her colleagues for her no-nonsense attitude and meticulous adherence to airline protocols. Spotting the Adams family, she stopped abruptly, her expression shifting from neutral to sharp scrutiny. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clipped. "These seats are reserved for specific ticket classes. May I see your boarding passes?" John, slightly confused but polite, handed over the tickets. Rebecca studied them carefully, her brow furrowing. She handed them back without a word, then turned to Marie. "You've placed your carry-on in the overhead bin assigned to a different row," Rebecca said curtly, pointing to the luggage. "Oh, I'm sorry," Marie replied quickly. "I'll move it if needed." Rebecca's tone grew sharper. "That's not the point. You're expected to store your items in the proper place. This is standard procedure." John interjected, sensing tension. "We're happy to move it. Is there a specific issue with where we're seated or our luggage?" Rebecca paused, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's about maintaining order," she said. "Just follow the rules." Tensions rise. The interaction, while seemingly minor, left a strange energy in its wake. Passengers nearby exchanged puzzled glances. Some whispered, wondering if something more significant had occurred. Rebecca, however, didn't stop there. She returned moments later with another flight attendant and gestured toward the family. "We'll need you to step off the plane," Rebecca announced firmly. John blinked, stunned. "What? Why? We haven't done anything wrong." Rebecca crossed her arms. "I don't need to explain myself further. Please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft immediately." Marie's eyes widened in disbelief as Lily and Max clung to her. "This must be a mistake," she said. "We're just trying to take our seats." Rebecca's expression hardened. "This is non-negotiable. If you don't comply, I will have to involve security." The other passengers began to murmur more loudly now, the unusual confrontation drawing their attention. A middle-aged woman seated nearby leaned over and whispered to her neighbor, "This doesn't seem right. That family hasn't caused any trouble." Another passenger chimed in, "Yeah, this is excessive. A public scene." John, determined to stay calm, stood up and faced Rebecca. "Please, can we speak with the captain? I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Rebecca's face flushed with irritation. "The captain doesn't have time for this. You need to leave now." The situation was spiraling quickly. The whispers among passengers turned into audible protests. One man called out, "This is ridiculous. They're not doing anything wrong." Rebecca ignored the growing discontent. She signaled to another crew member, who called airport security. 2 uniformed officers arrived moments later, their presence amplifying the tension. Lily, overwhelmed by the confrontation, began to cry. Marie knelt down to comfort her, tears welling in her own eyes. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered. "We'll figure this out." "Enough," Rebecca said sharply. "We have a schedule to keep." The turning point. As the Adams family reluctantly gathered their belongings and stepped into the jet bridge, several passengers began to voice their frustration more openly. A young woman in the third row stood up and addressed the remaining crew. "This is wrong. That family doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." Others nodded in agreement. "Yeah," said another passenger. "Someone needs to explain what's going on." Back on the plane, Rebecca returned to her post, but the atmosphere was electric with unease. Passengers were visibly upset, and whispers of complaints grew louder. Moments later, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his face a mask of professionalism, but with a hint of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began over the intercom, "please remain seated. I will personally review the situation and ensure this matter is resolved appropriately." The murmurs quieted slightly, but the tension remained thick. Rebecca's confidence seemed to waver as the captain glanced in her direction. She looked away, avoiding his gaze. The fallout. In the terminal, the Adams family stood in shock, surrounded by their luggage and unanswered questions. Max tugged on his father's sleeve. "Are we still going to Miami, Daddy?" John knelt down to his son's level, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "We'll figure this out, buddy. Don't worry." Back on the plane, passengers waited in silence. The captain returned to the cabin and approached Rebecca, his expression unreadable. After a brief but intense conversation, Rebecca's face drained of color. She turned, grabbed her belongings, and exited the plane without a word. The passengers erupted into whispers. "What just happened?" someone asked aloud. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Thank you for your patience. The situation has been resolved. We'll be departing shortly." But as the passengers settled in for the flight, the mystery lingered. What had prompted Rebecca's actions? Why had the Adams family been treated so poorly? And what would come next for them? Shadows of uncertainty. The Adams family sat in the bustling terminal, confusion etched on their faces. Lily, still clutching her mother's hand, sniffled quietly while Max leaned against his father, his usual energetic demeanor subdued. They had been told nothing, left in limbo without even the courtesy of an explanation. John looked at Marie, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "This isn't right," he muttered. "We were treated like criminals, and no one has said a word to us about why." Marie nodded, her own anger tempered by concern for the children. "I know," she said softly, "but we need to stay calm for the kids. Let's figure out what we can do." John pulled out his phone and began searching for the airline's customer service line. As he navigated through automated menus, his mind replayed the events on the plane. The flight attendant's sharp tone, her refusal to explain, the way security had been called without any real cause. It didn't add up. What had they done to deserve this? Passengers speak out. Meanwhile, back on the plane, the atmosphere was far from normal. The passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were restless, their whispers growing louder as Rebecca's abrupt departure sank in. A young woman named Angela, seated near the front of the plane, turned to the man beside her. "That was so uncalled for," she said. "That family didn't do anything wrong. Why would she act like that?" The man, an older gentleman with silver hair, nodded. "I've been flying for decades and I'd never seen anything like this. She was out of line." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Some passengers began discussing what they had seen more openly, recounting Rebecca's behavior and the family's calm attempts to de-escalate the situation. "She just kept pushing them," one man said. "The father was trying to reason with her, and she wouldn't even listen." Angela leaned forward, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Do you think it was something personal? Maybe she didn't like the way they looked or something?" The man hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know. But whatever it was, it felt wrong. You don't treat people like that." A decision to fight back. In the terminal, John was finally connected to a customer service representative. He recounted the events, his voice growing firmer as he detailed the humiliation his family had endured. "We were kicked off the plane without any explanation," he said. "The flight attendant was rude and dismissive. And now we're just sitting here with no idea what's going on. I need answers." The representative, who introduced herself as Sarah, responded in a carefully neutral tone. "I'm very sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Adams. I assure you that we take situations like this very seriously. I'll need to escalate this to his supervisor and get back to you as soon as possible." John clenched his jaw. "When? We've been waiting long enough." "I understand your frustration," Sarah replied. "I'll make sure someone contacts you within the next hour. In the meantime, I recommend staying near your gate in case we need to reach you." Frustrated but unwilling to argue further, John ended the call. He turned to Marie, who was trying to distract the children with a game on her phone. "They're escalating it," he said, "whatever that means." Marie sighed. "It means they're stalling." John nodded grimly. "Then we'll have to escalate it ourselves." Rebecca's unraveling. Rebecca sat in a small, windowless office near the airport's operations center. Her hands trembled as she gripped a cup of water, her mind racing. The captain's words echoed in her ears, his stern tone leaving no room for argument. "Your actions were unacceptable," he had said. "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately." She had protested, of course. "I was following protocol," she had insisted. That family was being disruptive. But the captain had shaken his head. "I spoke with the crew and several passengers. There was no disruption, Rebecca. You acted without cause, and now we have a situation on our hands." Rebecca's heart pounded as she replayed the confrontation in her mind. Had she overreacted? She had felt certain at the time that she was making the right call, but now she wasn't so sure. The faces of the passengers, their disapproval, their whispers, haunted her. A knock at the door snapped her back to reality. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit entered, his expression neutral. "Rebecca," he said, his voice measured. "I'm James Carter, head of HR for the airline. We need to have a conversation." Seeking justice. Back in the terminal, John had decided to take matters into his own hands. He began recording a video on his phone, addressing the events that had unfolded. "My name is John Adams," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Earlier today, my family and I were removed from our flight without explanation. The flight attendant who caused this has since been fired, but we still don't know why this happened. My children are scared, my wife is upset, and we deserve answers." He paused, glancing at his wife and children. "This isn't just about us," he continued. "This is about accountability. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we went through. Airlines need to do better." Marie watched him with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew John was doing what he thought was right, but she also worried about how far they would have to go to get the justice they deserved. The truth begins to surface. Inside the office, James Carter placed a stack of papers on the desk in front of Rebecca. "We've reviewed the reports from your colleagues and several passengers," he said. "The evidence is clear. Your actions were not only unprofessional, but also discriminatory." Rebecca's breath caught. "Discriminatory? That's not true. I was doing my job." Carter's expression hardened. "The family you removed did nothing to warrant your actions. Your behavior was rooted in assumptions, and those assumptions led to a serious breach of protocol. This is a matter of racial bias, Rebecca, and it's unacceptable." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, but found she had no words. Deep down, she knew there was truth in Carter's statement. She had acted on instinct, but those instincts had been flawed. And now, she was paying the price. Carter rose from his seat. "You'll be receiving formal notice of your termination," he said. "The airline will also be conducting mandatory bias training for all staff. We can't afford another incident like this." As he left the room, Rebecca felt the weight of her actions settle heavily on her shoulders. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was gone. And it was her own fault. A glimmer of hope. In the terminal, John's video began to gain traction online. Passengers who had witnessed the incident shared their accounts, amplifying the family's story. The airline, now facing mounting public pressure, issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising a full investigation. For the Adams family, it was a small step toward justice. But John knew this was just the beginning. As they prepared to board their rebooked flight, he resolved to keep fighting, not just for his family, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that too often failed to protect its most vulnerable. And as the plane lifted into the sky, carrying them toward Miami, John felt a spark of determination. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The storm breaks. As the Adams family finally boarded their rebooked flight to Miami, the tension in John's chest hadn't eased. The family's journey so far had been anything but ordinary, and the lack of resolution gnawed at him. He watched Marie buckle Max's seatbelt and offer him a soft smile, trying to keep a sense of normalcy for the kids. Lily, still clutching her stuffed bunny, looked out the window, her earlier tears leaving faint streaks on her cheeks. John leaned back in his seat, staring blankly at the safety instructions in the pocket in front of him. Despite the airline's assurances that the situation was under review, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being brushed off. The video he had recorded earlier had been uploaded to his social media account, and comments were already pouring in. Some were supportive, expressing outrage at the family's treatment. Others asked questions, trying to make sense of the vague details. But as the plane taxied down the runway, John knew one thing: this wasn't over. The aftermath of silence. Meanwhile, the original flight had already landed in Miami, carrying passengers who had witnessed the shocking incident firsthand. As they collected their belongings and headed to baggage claim, many continued their conversations about what had transpired. Angela, the young woman who had spoken out on the plane, pulled out her phone and began typing furiously into a notes app. She was drafting a detailed account of what she had seen, determined to have a record in case it became necessary later. The older man seated near her earlier nodded approvingly. "I think more people need to speak up," he said. "What happened wasn't right." At the same time, the whispers among other passengers grew louder. A few had even shared snippets of the story with local news reporters waiting outside the airport. The words racial discrimination and unfair treatment began to circulate, sparking the attention of the media. Rebecca's actions and her abrupt firing had left more questions than answers. Some passengers were sympathetic toward her, assuming she had acted under stress. Others were more critical, pointing out her dismissive attitude and refusal to explain her decisions. For Angela and others who had witnessed the event, one thing was clear: this story was far from over. John takes a stand. As the Adams family's flight leveled out at cruising altitude, John couldn't suppress the nagging urge to do more. He turned on his phone's airplane mode and opened the Notes app, jotting down everything he could remember from the moment they boarded the original flight. Details that seemed insignificant earlier now stood out. The subtle shift in Rebecca's tone when she spoke to them, the way she avoided eye contact with other passengers, and how quickly she escalated the situation. He included every interaction, every word spoken, and even his own feelings of confusion and disbelief. "If we don't document this now," he muttered to himself, "it'll get lost in the shuffle." Marie glanced over from her seat, her voice low but firm. "You're not letting this go, are you?" John shook his head. "No. And I don't think we should. If this was about something else, if we did something wrong, fine. But we didn't. And they treated us like we were dangerous, like we didn't belong." Marie sighed, her fingers brushing over Lily's hair as the little girl dozed off. "You're right. But where do we even start?" John's response was interrupted by a flight attendant approaching their row. "Sir, is everything okay?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. John nodded quickly. "Yeah, we're fine." Just processing a rough day. The flight attendant gave him a sympathetic smile before moving on. But the encounter left John uneasy. Every small interaction now felt charged, as if the events from earlier had tainted their ability to simply be passengers. A media frenzy. Unbeknownst to the family, John's video was spreading rapidly online. By the time they landed in Miami, local news outlets had picked up the story, and hashtags like #JusticeForAdamsFamily and #AirlineVias were trending. Comments flooded in from people who resonated with the family's experience. "I've been there," one user wrote. "Airlines treat people differently depending on how they look. This needs to stop." Others were less sympathetic. "We don't know the full story yet." A commenter argued. Maybe the family was being difficult, and the airline just followed protocol. Still, the overwhelming majority sided with the Adamses, demanding answers and accountability. Angela, who had witnessed the incident, found the video and added her own voice to the conversation. "I was on the flight," she posted. "That family was calm and respectful the entire time. The flight attendant escalated things unnecessarily. This wasn't about safety, it was about power." Her comment gained traction, drawing the attention of a prominent civil rights attorney, Marcus Hall, who reached out to Angela privately. "I'm interested in learning more about this incident," he wrote. "Would you be willing to share your account?" Angela agreed, her heart pounding as she realized the gravity of her role in the unfolding story. The airline responds. Back at the airline's headquarters, executives were scrambling to contain the situation. The PR team had already issued a statement expressing regret over the incident and promising a thorough investigation. But the vague language wasn't enough to quell public outrage. James Carter, the operations manager who had spoken with Rebecca earlier, found himself in a tense meeting with the airline's legal team and senior leadership. "We need to get ahead of this," one executive insisted. "If this turns into a racial discrimination lawsuit, it'll be a PR nightmare." Carter rubbed his temples. "We've already terminated the flight attendant. What more do you suggest?" The room fell silent for a moment before another executive chimed in. "We need to speak with the family directly. Offer them compensation, an apology, whatever it takes to make this go away." "And if they don't accept?" Carter asked, his voice heavy. "Then we need to prepare for the worst." A spark of hope. As the Adams family disembarked in Miami, they were greeted by a surprising sight. A small group of reporters waiting at the gate. Cameras clicked, and microphones were thrust forward as questions flew. "Mr. Adams, do you believe this was a case of racial discrimination? Has the airline contacted you since the incident? Do you plan to take legal action?" John shielded Lily and Max from the chaos, his protective instincts kicking in. "No comment," he said firmly, guiding his family through the throng. Marie looked at him anxiously as they made their way toward baggage claim. "What now?" she asked. John exhaled deeply. "We keep pushing. We tell our story, but on our terms. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As they collected their bags and headed toward their rental car, John's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Marcus Hall, the civil rights attorney. "Mr. Adams, I've seen your video and the witness accounts. I'd like to represent you and your family in seeking justice. Please let me know how I can help." John stared at the screen for a moment, his heart pounding. For the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. The fight for justice begins. The following morning in Miami, John sat at the small dining table in their hotel room, his laptop open and his phone buzzing with notifications. His video had surpassed 300,000 views overnight, and the hashtag #JusticeForAdamsFamily was now trending worldwide. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it came with pressure. People expected answers, and John still didn't have them. Marie, still in her pajamas, poured herself a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You were up all night, weren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. John nodded, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing Rebecca's face, hearing her voice telling us to get off that plane. He clenched his fists. I can't let this go, Marie. This wasn't just a bad day. It was systemic. People are treated like this every day, and it's like they expect us to just move on. Marie placed a hand on his arm. I know, and I'm with you. But we need to be careful. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about something much bigger. A voice of support. Later that day, John and Marie had their first call with Marcus Hall, the civil rights attorney who had reached out. His voice was steady and reassuring, a calm anchor amid the chaos swirling around them. Mr. and Mrs. Adams, Marcus began. First, let me say how sorry I am that you and your family had to go through this. What happened to you is unacceptable, and I want to help you seek accountability, not just for your family, but for everyone who's ever been treated this way. John leaned forward, gripping his phone tightly. Thank you, Mr. Hall. We appreciate it. But where do we even start? The airline's been vague, and we still don't know why we were kicked off the plane. Marcus's tone grew firmer. That's the first thing we'll address. I'll file a formal request for all internal reports related to the incident. If they refuse, we'll escalate to a legal demand. We also need to amplify your story. Public pressure can be a powerful tool. Marie hesitated. We've already gotten so much attention online. But I worry about the kids. They've been through enough. Marcus's voice softened. I understand. We'll keep the focus on the facts and shield your children from unnecessary exposure. This is about holding the airline accountable and pushing for systemic change. The airline's countermove. At the airline's corporate headquarters, executives were in damage control mode. Rebecca's firing had done little to quell the backlash, and the company's vague public statements were being dissected by media outlets and social media users alike. James Carter, the operations manager, sat across from the airline's CEO, Ellen Harper. She was a sharp, no-nonsense leader with years of experience navigating corporate crises, but even she seemed rattled. We're hemorrhaging public trust, Ellen said, her tone clipped. Our stock has already taken a hit, and if this turns into a lawsuit, we're looking at a PR disaster. James adjusted his tie. We've terminated Rebecca and announced an internal investigation. Isn't that enough to show we're taking this seriously? Ellen shook her head. No, it's not enough. People don't just want accountability. They want transparency. And right now, we're giving them nothing. A younger executive, seated near the end of the table, spoke up hesitantly. Should we consider reaching out to the family directly? Offer them a settlement? Ellen's eyes narrowed. We can't afford to look like we're trying to buy their silence. It'll only make us look guiltier. No, we need to get ahead of this with a public statement, a real one this time. And we need to show action. James frowned. What kind of action? Bias training for all staff, Ellen said, and a public forum where we take questions from passengers. We need to control the narrative before it controls us. Witnesses stepped forward. As Marcus prepared to escalate the case, Angela, the young woman who had witnessed the incident on the plane, reached out to John through social media. They arranged a video call, during which Angela shared her perspective. I was sitting just a few rows away, Angela said, her expression earnest. From the moment that flight attendant approached your family, it felt wrong. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was hostile. And when you asked to speak to the captain, I could tell she was trying to shut you down. John listened intently, his jaw tightening. Thank you for speaking up, Angela. It means a lot to us. I've already submitted my account to Marcus Hall, Angela added. And there are other passengers who feel the same way. Some of them are willing to come forward too. Hearing this gave John a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated. Rebecca's revelation. Meanwhile, Rebecca sat in the small apartment she now called home, staring blankly at the news coverage of the incident. She had been avoiding the internet since her firing, But curiosity got the better of her. The video of the Addams family's removal had gone viral, and the comments were brutal. They should have fired her on the spot. This is what happens when people let power go to their heads. Rebecca's stomach churned as she scrolled. She had made a mistake, a big one. But the backlash felt unbearable. And yet, deep down, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the airline was using her as a scapegoat. She thought back to the mandatory training sessions she had attended over the years. They had covered safety protocols, customer service techniques, and conflict resolution, but nothing about recognizing bias or handling situations involving diverse passengers. In fact, when she had flagged concerns about a lack of training in the past, her managers had dismissed her. "We don't have time for that," they had said. "Just follow protocol." Rebecca clenched her fists. If the airline wanted to make her the face of the problem, they needed to take a hard look in the mirror first. Building momentum. In the days that followed, Marcus Hall organized a press conference, inviting the media to hear directly from the Addams family and witnesses like Angela. The event drew national attention, with cameras rolling as John stepped up to the podium. "My family and I were humiliated and removed from a flight without cause," John began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "The airline has yet to provide a clear explanation for their actions, and the flight attendant responsible was fired without addressing the systemic issues that led to this incident." He paused, scanning the room. "This isn't just about us. It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Angela spoke next, recounting what she had witnessed on the plane. Her testimony was followed by statements from other passengers, each one painting a damning picture of Rebecca's behavior and the airline's handling of the situation. By the end of the press conference, the hashtag Justice for Addams family had reached new heights, and calls for change grew louder. The tipping point. The airline, now under immense public pressure, announced sweeping changes: mandatory bias training for all employees, an independent review of their protocols, and a personal apology to the Addams family. Ellen Harper delivered the apology herself in a live broadcast, acknowledging the airline's failures and pledging to do better. For the Addams family, it was a step in the right direction. But the fight wasn't over. As Marcus prepared to negotiate a settlement and push for broader reforms, John and Marie resolved to keep their story alive, not for revenge, but for change. "We didn't ask for this," John said during an interview, "but now that we're here, we're going to make sure it counts." Unraveling the system. The momentum behind the Addams family's fight for justice grew in ways they never anticipated. The press conference had made headlines across the country, and the airline's subsequent promises of reform had only fueled the public's curiosity. But for John and Marie, the whirlwind of media attention felt bittersweet. They wanted closure, not fame. "Do you think this is enough?" Marie asked one evening as they sat together in the hotel room, the kids fast asleep in the adjoining room. "The airline apologized. They're implementing bias training. Maybe we should just take the settlement and move on." John looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I've thought about that," he admitted. "But what happens after we move on? What about the next family that gets treated like this? If we don't push harder, nothing really changes." Marie sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. "I just want things to go back to normal." "I do too," John said, wrapping his arm around her. "But this isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." A former insider speaks. The next morning, Marcus Hall called with unexpected news. "I've been contacted by someone who used to work for the airline," he said, his tone serious. "She claims to have information that could shed light on what happened." John frowned. "What kind of information?" "She didn't give specifics over the phone," Marcus replied. "But she's willing to meet with us. If what she says is credible, it could change everything." Later that afternoon, John and Marcus met with the former employee, a woman named Clara Reynolds. Clara had worked for the airline's corporate office for over a decade, handling customer service policies and employee training. She had left the company a year earlier, disillusioned by what she described as a toxic culture. "First, let me say I'm so sorry for what happened to your family," Clara began, her voice steady but empathetic. "I've seen this kind of thing happen before, and it's one of the reasons I left." John leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Clara glanced around the quiet cafe where they were meeting, as if checking for prying ears. The airline has a long history of handling passenger complaints poorly, especially when those complaints involve discrimination. They prioritize protecting the brand over addressing the real issues. She pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "This is a collection of internal emails and reports I saved before I left. It includes records of incidents similar to yours, where passengers of color were removed from flights without proper cause. In most cases, the airline blamed it on protocol and quietly settled with the affected parties." John flipped through the documents, his anger rising with each page. "This is unbelievable. They knew this was happening, and they did nothing." Clara nodded. "They've been sweeping these issues under the rug for years. The bias training they're promising now, it's not new. They've been offering the same program for over a decade, and it's completely ineffective. It's more about optics than real change." Rebecca's perspective. While the Adams family dug deeper into the airline's systemic failures, Rebecca sat in her dimly lit apartment, scrolling through articles about the case. Every headline seemed to vilify her, painting her as the sole villain in the story. But the more she read, the more she began to see the cracks in her own perspective. She thought back to her training sessions at the airline. The emphasis had always been on following protocol, resolving conflicts quickly, and maintaining order. But what they hadn't taught her, what they never even mentioned, was how to confront her own biases or recognize the ways they might influence her decisions. Rebecca sighed, running a hand through her hair. She had made a mistake, a huge one, and she couldn't undo the harm she had caused. But as she read the growing backlash against the airline, she realized something. She wasn't the only one to blame. The system had failed her too, conditioning her to act without questioning the larger implications of her actions. For the first time since her firing, Rebecca picked up the phone and dialed a number she had been avoiding. "Hello, this is Rebecca. I'm the flight attendant from the Adams family incident. I think it's time I told my side of the story." The turning point. Clara's revelations gave Marcus the ammunition he needed to escalate the case. Armed with evidence of the airline's systemic failures, he filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation and sent copies of the documents to several prominent journalists. The response was immediate. News outlets published exposes detailing the airline's history of mishandling discrimination cases. Headlines like "Airline Under Fire for Systemic Bias" and "Former Employee Exposes Company's Culture of Silence" dominated the news cycle. Public outrage reached a fever pitch, with calls for boycotts and demands for accountability flooding the airline's social media pages. Shareholders began pressuring the company's leadership to take decisive action, fearing the long-term impact on their bottom line. Rebecca's confession. As the airline scrambled to manage the fallout, Rebecca's decision to speak out added a new layer to the story. In an exclusive interview with a major news outlet, she admitted to mishandling the situation with the Adams family, but also highlighted the lack of meaningful training and support from the airline. "I'm not excusing what I did," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "But the truth is, I wasn't prepared to handle situations like this. The airline tells us to follow protocol, but the protocol is broken. It doesn't account for the human side of these interactions." Her confession sparked mixed reactions. Some saw it as a genuine attempt to take responsibility, while others viewed it as an attempt to shift blame. But for the Adams family, it was a small step toward the accountability they had been seeking. The family's resolve. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, John and Marie found themselves at the center of a much larger conversation about systemic bias and corporate accountability. Their story had sparked a movement, and they were determined to see it through. In a live interview with a national news anchor, John spoke directly to the millions of viewers who had followed their journey. "This isn't just about what happened to my family," he said. "It's about creating a world where no one has to experience what we did. Where companies don't just protect their image but protect their customers. This fight isn't over, but we're in it for the long haul." Marie, sitting beside him, added, "We want change, not just for us, but for everyone. We're grateful for the support we've received, and we hope it leads to real accountability, not just empty promises." The ripple effect. The pressure on the airline continued to mount. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of other passengers who had experienced similar incidents, further exposing the company's systemic issues. Advocacy groups used the Addams family story as a rallying cry for broader reforms in the airline industry, calling for federal regulations to address discrimination and bias. And while the Addams family still carried the emotional scars of their experience, they found solace in knowing that their fight was making a difference. As they walked along the sunny beaches of Miami with Lily and Max, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This is just the beginning," John said, watching his children play in the sand. "But it's a start. A new dawn." The national conversation, ignited by the Addams family's ordeal, reached far beyond the airline industry. Activists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens began calling for sweeping reforms to address systemic discrimination in public spaces and corporate accountability. For John and Marie, their lives had become a whirlwind of interviews, legal meetings, and public appearances. They had never intended to become the face of a movement, but as the days passed, they embraced their role with growing determination. One morning, John sat at the hotel desk, poring over a draft of a statement Marcus had prepared for an upcoming congressional hearing. Marie entered the room with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Another late night?" she asked, setting a cup in front of him. John nodded, his eyes scanning the document. "Marcus says, this is our chance to push for real change. If Congress gets involved, we could see new regulations that force airlines to address these issues." Marie sat beside him, sipping her coffee. "Do you ever feel like this is bigger than us? Like it's taken on a life of its own?" John looked at her, his expression softening. "Every day. But I also feel like we're doing something important. For Lily, for Max, and for every family that's been treated like we were." Marie smiled faintly. "Then let's make it count." The congressional hearing. A week later, John and Marie sat before a packed congressional hearing room, surrounded by cameras and reporters. The air buzzed with anticipation as lawmakers filed in, ready to hear testimony about the Addams family's experience and the broader issues it represented. When it was John's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and addressed the panel. "My name is John Addams, and I'm here today not just as a father or a passenger, but as someone who believes in accountability. What happened to my family was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that prioritizes profit and convenience over fairness and respect." He went on to recount the events of that fateful day, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We were removed from that plane without explanation, treated as if we were a threat. It wasn't just humiliating, it was dehumanizing. And when we asked for answers, we were met with silence." Marie followed with her own testimony, highlighting the impact the incident had on their children. "Our daughter asked us if we had done something wrong, if we weren't allowed on the plane because of how we looked. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes the world is unfair, even when you've done nothing wrong?" Their words resonated deeply, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the audience. As the hearing progressed, Marcus presented evidence from Clara and other witnesses, painting a damning picture of the airline's systemic failures. By the end of the session, lawmakers pledged to draft new legislation aimed at preventing discrimination in the airline industry, including mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and better protections for passengers. Rebecca's redemption. While the Addams family pushed forward with their fight for justice, Rebecca continued her own journey of self-reflection. After her televised interview, she had received a flood of messages, some supportive, others scathing. But one message in particular stood out: an invitation from a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing bias in the workplace. Rebecca hesitated at first, unsure if she deserved the opportunity, but after weeks of soul-searching, she decided to take the leap. The nonprofit invited her to participate in a workshop alongside other former employees who had been involved in high-profile discrimination cases. The experience was both humbling and eye-opening. Rebecca listened as others shared their stories, recognizing patterns of systemic failure that mirrored her own experience. For the first time, she began to see her actions not just as an individual failure, but as part of a larger broken system. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Rebecca reached out to Marcus. "I want to help," she said. "I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can use my story to prevent it from happening again." Marcus was hesitant but ultimately agreed. Together, they arranged for Rebecca to meet with the Adams family. The meeting took place in a private conference room, away from the media spotlight. John and Marie were initially reluctant, unsure if they wanted to face the woman who had caused them so much pain. But Marcus convinced them that it could be an important step toward closure. When Rebecca entered the room, she looked visibly nervous, her usual confidence replaced by humility. "Mr. and Mrs. Adams," she began, her voice trembling. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I can't express how sorry I am for what I put your family through." John's jaw tightened, but he nodded for her to continue. "I made a terrible mistake," Rebecca admitted. "I acted out of fear and assumptions, and I didn't stop to question my actions. I let you down, and I let myself down. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm committed to making sure this never happens again." Marie, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, spoke softly. "Do you understand what you did to our kids? Lily still asks why we were kicked off the plane. She thinks we weren't good enough." Rebecca's face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't take back what I did, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The room fell silent as the Adamses absorbed her words. Finally, John spoke. "We're not here to punish you, Rebecca. We're here because we want change. If you're serious about helping us fight for that change, then maybe something good can come from all of this." Rebecca nodded, her expression one of gratitude and determination. "I am. I promise. A movement is born." Over the next few months, the Adams family, Marcus and Rebecca, worked together to launch a new initiative aimed at addressing bias in the airline industry and beyond. They called it Wings of Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to advocating for systemic reform, supporting affected families, and educating employees about implicit bias. The initiative gained widespread support, attracting endorsements from civil rights leaders, lawmakers, and even other airlines seeking to improve their own practices. The Adams family became frequent speakers at events and conferences, sharing their story to inspire change. Rebecca, too, became an advocate, using her experience to highlight the need for better training and accountability. While her journey of redemption was far from over, she found purpose in contributing to the movement. A new chapter. As the dust began to settle, the Adams family finally found a sense of peace. Their fight for justice had transformed their lives in ways they never expected, but it had also brought them closer together. One evening, as they walked along the beach, Lily looked up at John and asked, "Daddy, are we heroes?" John smiled and knelt down to her level. "We're just a family that stood up for what's right," he said. "And sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference." Marie placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "We didn't ask for this fight," she said, "but I'm glad we saw it through." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the Adams family felt a renewed sense of hope. Their journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. And as they faced the future, they knew they had made the world just a little bit better, not just for themselves, but for everyone. A final push. In the months following the creation of Wings of Justice, the Addams family witnessed the power of their story ripple across industries and communities. Airline executives faced increasing pressure to implement real, measurable reforms. Companies across sectors began reevaluating their training programs, ensuring they addressed bias, equity, and accountability. However, for John and Marie, the journey was far from over. They still carried the weight of their children's questions, the humiliation of that day, and the fight for lasting change. And as their nonprofit gained traction, new challenges arose. One day, Marcus Hall called with an unexpected update. "John, I've received a notice from the Department of Transportation. They've opened an official inquiry into the airline's practices, and they're asking if your family would testify again. This time as part of their regulatory review." John leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Marcus's voice was steady. "I do. This isn't just about one airline anymore. It's about setting a precedent that will affect the entire industry." Marie, overhearing the conversation, touched John's arm. "We started this fight, and we owe it to ourselves, and others, to see it through." The final hearing. The hearing took place in Washington, D.C., in a room packed with regulators, journalists, and representatives from multiple airlines. The Addams family, accompanied by Marcus and Angela, took their seats near the front. Rebecca, now a key advocate for systemic reform, sat a few rows behind them, her presence a testament to her commitment to change. When John spoke, his words were clear and heartfelt. This fight was never about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that no family has to go through what mine did, being treated as less than human, judged unfairly, and left without answers. He paused, scanning the room. "But this isn't just about my family. It's about every passenger who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, every employee who hasn't been given the tools to succeed, and every company that thinks they can sweep these issues under the rug. Today, we have a chance to change that." Marie added her voice to the testimony, speaking of the emotional toll on their children and the importance of addressing bias at every level of the industry. Her words drew nods and murmurs of agreement from the panel. Rebecca was called as a surprise witness. She recounted her experience on that day, her training, or lack thereof, and her realization of how her actions reflected a larger systemic problem. "I've spent months learning, listening, and reflecting," she said, "and I can tell you that I acted out of ignorance, but that ignorance was shaped by a system that failed me and countless others. We need real reform, not just promises." Victory in healing. The hearing concluded with a unanimous decision by the Department of Transportation to implement sweeping changes to the airline industry. These included mandatory and recurring bias training, enhanced reporting and accountability mechanisms, and penalties for companies that failed to address complaints of discrimination effectively. The Addams family's victory was celebrated as a watershed moment, marking the beginning of a new era in passenger rights and corporate accountability. The nonprofit they had founded became a leading voice in advocating for fairness, not just in the airline industry, but across public spaces. A new beginning. Months later, life began to return to a new kind of normal for the Addams family. They returned to their careers and routines, but their experiences had left an indelible mark on them. Lily and Max, though young, had begun to understand the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Lily climbed onto John's lap. "Daddy," she said, "why did that lady think we did something bad?" John took a deep breath, pulling her close. "Sometimes, Lily, people make mistakes because they don't understand. But what's important is that we learn from those mistakes and make things better." Lily nodded, her small hand resting on his. "And we made things better, right?" John smiled, his heart full. "We did, sweetheart, and we'll keep making things better." Marie joined them, wrapping her arms around John and Lily. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, its warm glow a reminder that even after the darkest days, a new dawn always comes. Epilogue. A legacy of change. Years later, Wings of Justice became a globally recognized organization, known for its tireless work in addressing systemic bias and promoting accountability. The Addams family story was taught in universities and used as a case study in corporate training programs. Rebecca became a leading voice in the movement, using her own mistakes as a platform for advocacy. Her journey of redemption inspired others to confront their biases and strive for change. As for the Addams family, they continued to live their lives with the quiet pride of knowing that their fight had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for countless others. They had turned their pain into purpose, proving that even the smallest voices could spark a movement and change the world. And as they walked hand in hand through a bustling airport years later, passing by smiling passengers and attentive staff, they felt a sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better, and they had helped make it that way.